The European Commission is responsible for the administration of the European Union and represents the general interest. Our duty is to represent laws and legislation to impose European laws when necessary. Set objectives and priorities for action, managing and excluding European Union policies and the financial plans, and lastly, represents the Union outside Europe. We are located in Brazil, Belgium, and also have some service in Luxembourg. We also have representatives in all states that are members of the EU and 139 body of the representative worldwide.
Europe is the second smallest continent in the world and is mainly surrounded by large bodies of water such as the Arctic and Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean, Black and Caspian Seas. The increase in temperature, the melting of polar ice caps and the rising sea levels all have a profound effect on the European Union. These changes to our surrounding environment and rise in sea levels are continually increasing flood rates and the erosion of coastal zones. Due to the coastal zones becoming more susceptible to flooding and erosion, approximately 1/4 of the European coastline is already eroding. This has a large effect on Europe as around 1/3 of the population lives within 50 kilometers of the coast. A report dating back to 2004 stated that 55% of Poland's coastlines was already being affected by erosion, followed by approximately 38% of Cyprus and 33% of Latvia. While today, wildlife habitat and filtration for fresh water constitute more than 1/3 of the endangered land of the European coasts, flooding and erosion also cause economic damage as the European Commission valued the assets within 500 metres of Europe's seas to total over €500 billion. The rising of sea levels also affect the availability of fresh water as the seawater pushes further into underground water tables, contaminating freshwater sources. This also increases the intrusion of seawater into freshwater habitats, threatening the biodiversity of many wetlands as well as multiple bird and plant species. The effects of water availability by climate change are already apparent throughout Europe, as changes in river flows can already be seen, with a reduction in southern and eastern Europe and increases in seasonal changes throughout other regions. As most of Europe's fresh water supply originates in mountain areas, with 40% of Europe's freshwater supply being obtained from the Alps, changes in the snow and glacier dynamics continue to raise concerns of water shortages across the continent. There is also threat of flash flooding in lower mountain and valley areas, as larger amounts of water flow straight into the river system. Yet although rising temperatures contribute to the rise in sea levels, they also lead to increased evapotranspiration levels, therefore posing a threat to hydroelectric power through diminishing water supplies, which is a major energy source for large areas across Europe.
When considering how Europe is affected by global warming, it's important to consider the issues that surround health, economy, and well-being. According to the World Health Organization, heat waves can affect human health and lead to additional deaths. A study conducted in 2008 based on data collected from 12 European cities concluded that for every degree increase in temperature above a certain threshold, respiratory admissions increased by 4.5% for those above the age of 75. Global warming is causing the surface temperature to gradually rise, meaning these extreme temperature events are only going to become more and more common. Besides the immediate health risks, heat waves can also lead to increased stress levels, reducing productivity of a general population. This is not only relevant to Europe, but in fact all countries concerned with economic growth and prosperity. Many of the outcomes attributed to a permanent global temperature increase are affecting European countries today, in more ways than just the immediate. This year, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is addressing the threat of global warming. The total expenditure of most, if not all, European countries is expected to rise due to costs of complications related to rising temperature and sea level. European countries are expected to invest money in numerous policy areas including disaster risk reduction, coastal zone management, agriculture and rural development, health services, spatial planning, regional development, ecosystems and water management. This is expected to affect most economic sectors.
As one of the major leading stakeholders, we accept our role in the contribution to some of the current climate change problems. As we are an industrialised nation, we are accountable for roughly 11,500 power stations and refineries in 30 countries consisting of the 28 EU member states, as well as Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. These are responsible for almost half of the EU's carbon emissions, including power and heat generation, oil refineries, and other pollutant production emissions. One of the major global warming threats is the emission of greenhouse gases, the primary contributor being fossil fuels, alongside methane and nitrous oxide. As a nation, we had contributed to 15% of global fossil fuel emissions from 1993 to 2005 through the combustion of oil, coal and natural gases, as well as cement manufacturing and bunker fuels, along with other forms of emission. The European Union believes that one of the best ways to tackle climate change is through the carbon trading system. Through our emissions trading scheme, we aim to lower pollution levels and stabilise climate change. The system is based on a cap and trade structure which sets an annual cap on emissions that is to be reduced annually by a linear factor of 1.74%. The scheme gives industries a financial incentive to reduce their amount of fossil fuel emission and to invest in green energy and technology. An overall reduction in emissions of approximately 50 million tonnes was recorded in 2008 through our carbon trading program. The emission allowances set up in the ETS is a major step towards reducing environmental damage and minimalising climate change. In March 2007, we were the first party in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to suggest the mitigation on greenhouse gas emission reduction beyond the Kyoto Protocol, which expired in 2012. By 2020, our focus is to greatly reduce fossil fuel emission and focus on renewable energy. Currently in its third phase, the revision of the ETS in 2009 has approved that a single EU-wide cap on emissions applies rather than the previous national caps which ran in phases 1 and 2. As well as this, the default method for allocating allowances is now done through auctioning instead of free allocation. The introduction of the scheme has led to a well-developed market for carbon permits, which is now a trading commodity in Europe.
Many European countries have adopted national programs aimed at reduction emissions. Similar EU-level policies and measures include increased use of renewable energy, such as wind, solar, biomass, and combined heat with power installations, improved energy efficiency in buildings, industry, household appliances, reduction of carbon dioxide emissions from new passenger cars, abandonment measures in the manufacturing industry, measures to reduce emission from landfills. Adaptation to climate change. Adaptation means anticipating the effects of climate change and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause or exploit opportunities. Early action will save on damage caused later. Adaptation strategies are needed at all levels of administration, from the local to the international level. The EU adaptation strategy focuses on 3 key objectives. 1. Promoting action by member states. The Commission will encourage all member states to adopt comprehensive adaptation strategies and will provide funding to help them build up their adaptation capacities and take action. It will also support adaptation in cities by launching a voluntary commitment based on the Government of Maya initiative. Second, climate proofing action at UV level by further promoting adaptation in key vulnerable sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, and cohesion policy, ensuring that Europe's infrastructure is made more resilient and promoting the use of insurance against natural and man-made disasters. The last one. Better informed decision making by addressing gaps in knowledge about adaptation and further developing the European Climate Adaptation Platform as the one-stop shop for adaptation information in Europe. Broadly speaking, the following 4 phases of EU climate change policy can be identified: late 1980s to 1992, formation and formulation phase; 1992 and 2001, Kyoto Protocol negotiation phase; 2001 and 5, Kyoto Protocol rescue phase; and 4, since 2005, implementation phase and Kyoto Protocol follow-up agreement negotiation phase. The EU is governed by several institutions. They do not correspond exactly to the traditional branches of government or division of power in representative democracies. Rather, they embody the EU's dual, supranational, and intergovernmental character. The European Council acts as the strategic guide for EU policy. The European Commission is essentially the EU's executive and upholds the common interest of the EU as a whole. The Council of the European Union, also called the Council of Ministers, representative to 28 nation governments. The European Parliament represents the citizens of the EU. Other institutions also play key roles. The Court of Justice interprets EU laws and its rulings are binding. A court of authorities monitors financial management. The European Central Bank manages the euro and EU monetary policy, and advisory committees represent economic, social, and regional interests. The European Union is accountable because that the political system of the European Union meets democratic standards and is accountable to the European citizens. If it doesn't, the European Union will be in danger of losing legitimacy.
On the 22nd of April 2016, the Paris Agreement was open for signatures. The European Union, along with the US, China, India, Australia, and many other countries, signed the agreement, and it remains open until April of 2017. The aims of the agreement are a long-term goal of keeping the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, to aim to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, since this would significantly reduce risks and the impacts of climate change. On the need for global emissions to peak as soon as possible, recognizing that this will take longer for developing countries, to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science from the European Union. Countries will come together every 5 years to set more ambitious targets as required by science. They will report to each other and the public on how well they are doing to implement their targets. To track progress towards the long-term goal through a robust transparency and accountability system. To strengthen society's ability to deal with the impacts of climate change. The EU and other developed countries will continue to support climate action to reduce emissions and build resilience to climate change impacts in developing countries. The agreement will come into play after 55 countries that make up 55% of global emissions have applied for ratification. The predecessor to the Paris Agreement was the Kyoto Protocol. Over 100 developing countries, along with China and India, were exempt from the protocol. Due to this, the US did not ratify the protocol, which disagrees with us, the European Union. Australia originally did not ratify the protocol, however they did in 2008 due to change of government. The Paris Agreement, as stated before, includes a number of developing countries that weren't included in the Kyoto Protocol. China, India, Australia, and the US have all signed the Paris Agreement, which puts us on the same page and is another step towards climate change. The European Union has led the charge towards reducing greenhouse emissions and climate change. After the limited participation of the Kyoto Protocol, we have been building a rather extensive coalition of developed and developing countries that will help shape the successful outcome of the Paris Agreement.